Walk into a museum with a 4-year-old and watch what happens. You tell them not to touch. They reach out anyway, almost without deciding to. Their hand moves before their brain seems to catch up. You call it disobedience. It is something else entirely. Your child's hands are not separate from their thinking. In a very real sense, their hands are how they think. Here is the strange part. Adults experience the world mostly through their eyes first. We see an object, judge it, decide whether it is worth touching. Children do not follow that order. For a young child, seeing something interesting and touching it are almost the same action, happening in the same instant, with barely any decision in between. So why would a developing brain be wired this way? Because touch builds knowledge faster than sight alone ever could. Psychologist Jean Piaget, who spent decades studying how children construct understanding of the world, identified what he called the sensoromotor stage, the period from birth to roughly age 2 where children learn almost entirely through physical interaction. Decoded simply, this means a baby does not understand a rattle by looking at it. They understand a rattle by shaking it, dropping it, putting it in their mouth, and banging it against the floor. Piaget's work showed that knowledge, for a young child, is built through the hands long before it is built through reasoning. And here is what most parents do not realize. This is not a phase that fully ends at age 2. It echoes for years afterward, especially whenever a child encounters something unfamiliar. Think about what touch is actually doing inside the brain. When your child touches an object, they are activating something called the somatosensory cortex, a strip of brain tissue that processes physical sensation, decoded simply as the brain's map of the body and everything it feels. This region works closely with memory and emotional processing centers. Touching something does not just tell the brain what an object feels like. It tells the brain to remember it more deeply than sight alone ever could. This is why a child who touches a seashell at the beach will often remember that exact texture years later, while a seashell they only saw in a photograph fades from memory almost immediately. The hand is not a secondary sense for a child. It is one of the primary doorways into learning. Here is the counterintuitive twist. The urge to touch everything is not impulsive in the way it looks. It is closer to a form of active research. A child who pats a dog, squeezes a pillow, or presses a finger into wet paint is not being careless. They are running a physical experiment, gathering texture, weight, temperature, and resistance, the same way a scientist gathers data before drawing a conclusion. Neuroscientist and psychologist Linda Smith, who studies how infants learn through movement and physical exploration, found that children who are allowed more hands-on interaction with objects during early development tend to build more accurate mental categories for those objects later. Decoded simply, this means a child who is permitted to handle, turn, and manipulate things, within reason, builds a richer, more detailed understanding of the physical world than a child who is mostly told to look without touching. This reframes something that might have felt frustrating before. The toddler who insists on touching every leaf on a walk is not ignoring you. They are constructing their own private encyclopedia of texture, one leaf at a time. But there is a deeper layer to this, one that connects to emotional regulation as well. Touch does not only build knowledge. It also calms a nervous system that is still learning how to manage itself. Psychiatrist and researcher Tiffany Field, known for decades of research on touch in child development, found that physical contact and tactile stimulation can lower cortisol, the body's primary stress hormone, decoded simply as the chemical the body releases when it feels under pressure. This is part of why a stressed or overstimulated child often reaches for something to grip, squeeze, or rub. Their hands are quietly trying to regulate what their emotions cannot yet manage on their own. This explains a pattern many parents notice but rarely connect. A child who is anxious before a doctor's visit might suddenly want to touch every object in the waiting room. It is rarely random curiosity. It is often the nervous system reaching for something solid and controllable in an environment that otherwise feels unpredictable. So when your child reaches for something they were told not to touch, two systems are usually working at once. One is genuinely trying to learn. The other may be quietly trying to cope. This is also why simply saying don't touch rarely works as well as parents hope. The instruction speaks to the part of the brain handling rules and consequences. It does nothing for the part of the brain that is hungry for sensory information. Telling a hand not to move is asking logic to override a need the logic centers were never in charge of to begin with. Here is the part that changes how this whole behavior can be understood. As children grow older, the physical urge to touch everything does not disappear so much as it becomes quieter and more selective. Adults still do this, just in smaller, more socially acceptable ways. You run your hand along a smooth railing without thinking. You squeeze a stress ball during a long meeting. You instinctively pick up an object on a shelf you have no intention of buying. The same sensor-motor wiring that drove your child to touch everything as a toddler is still alive in you. It has simply learned to wait for moments when no one is watching closely enough to call it out. Which brings the museum back into view. Your child reaches for the painting, the statue, the glass case they were told to leave alone. It looks like defiance. It is closer to devotion. Their hands are not betraying your instructions. They are doing exactly what a young brain evolved to do, reaching toward the world to understand it, one texture at a time, long before words could ever explain what their fingers already know.